In a New York hotel lobby, a single handshake never happened. A confident CEO dismissed a quietly dressed black man, assuming he didn't belong. Hours later, she learned the truth. He controlled the only capital that could save her company. Like and subscribe, and watch how this decision reshaped both their lives. The Grand Regency's lobby smelled of overbrewed coffee and expensive intentions, its marble floors gleaming with a clinical perfection suited to executives, influencers, and closers. Emily Lancaster fit right in. Perfectly tailored slate gray blazer, black stilettos from Ferragamo's spring collection hair pulled into a severe, disciplined bun. She didn't just walk into the room. She moved like she owned the air between its walls. Her phone buzzed. One message. Investor arrives 9:00 sharp. Private profile. Mail. No photo. Her assistant hadn't been able to dig up anything more, only a forwarded confirmation email from a Row Capital address and a note that the investor preferred to arrive without an entourage. Emily hated ambiguity. It made her feel unprepared, and Emily Lancaster never arrived unprepared. She glanced at her watch, 8:59. Right on cue, the door opened. A man entered. He looked ordinary. Black t-shirt, dark jeans, white sneakers, a backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. Not a Rolex in sight, not even a leather briefcase. Just calm eyes and a quiet demeanor that didn't ask permission to belong. He approached with a steady gait, his expression unreadable. "Miss Lancaster," he said, gently extending a hand. She barely looked at it. "Delivery." Her tone was sharp, clipped. "I didn't order anything. You need to leave." There was a pause, just long enough for something to flicker behind his eyes. Not anger, not even surprise. Just a soft, wounded awareness. Then slowly, he lowered his hand. "I believe we had a 9 a.m. appointment," he said. Emily narrowed her gaze. Something about the calm in his voice irritated her. It felt like defiance. "I don't take meetings I didn't personally confirm, especially not with someone who—" She stopped, her eyes scanning him from head to toe. "Who clearly doesn't belong here." He didn't reply, and that made it worse. Around them, a few heads turned. A concierge looked up, uncertain whether to intervene. She reached for the tall coffee cup in front of her. Not even thinking, just acting on instinct, on some primal need to reassert control, she hurled the contents straight at his chest. The liquid hit like a gasp. A dark stain spread across his black shirt, steaming as it soaked in. 2 security guards started forward from the edge of the lobby, hands half-raised, eyes locked on the spill. One of them hesitated when the man shook his head slightly, signaling that he did not want it escalated. The concierge flinched, then lifted a phone as if to call someone, but froze when he saw the man's expression remain calm. "I said leave." There was no scream, no protest, just the quiet hiss of fabric, the stunned silence of witnesses, and the sound of his breath, controlled and steady. He stepped back, his face unreadable. Then, gently, he reached into his backpack, pulled out a small monogrammed handkerchief, and began dabbing the liquid from his shirt without looking away from her. "This will follow you," he said, not as a threat, but like someone stating a future weather forecast. Then he turned and walked out. Emily exhaled, her pulse high. Around her, the lobby remained frozen. A young woman nearby recorded everything on her phone screen, lit like judgment in the palm of her hand. By the time Emily reached the elevator, the clip was already online, posted with a caption that stripped away context, then shared into larger accounts that fed on outrage. It wasn't until the concierge finally approached her, nervously wringing his hands, that Emily realized her own coffee-stained hand was still trembling. "Miss Lancaster, are you sure that wasn't your 9 a.m. appointment?" She laughed, short and bitter. "If that was my investor, we're all doomed." Outside, the sun had shifted slightly behind the clouds. Inside, something irreversible had already been set in motion. Emily Lancaster learned the language of worth long before she learned the language of doubt. She grew up in Manhattan boardrooms, where introductions were measured in seconds and respect arrived only after a glance at your wrist, your shoes, the certainty in your voice. Her father taught her that hesitation was a weakness, that pauses invited predators, and that the quickest way to lose a room was to admit uncertainty. By the time she graduated from Wharton, Emily had already perfected a posture that suggested inevitability, as if success were not a possibility, but a birthright that simply needed efficient execution. At Veritas Systems, that posture hardened into a philosophy. Meetings were arenas. Interruptions were tools. Apologies were admissions of incompetence. Employees learned to read her moods by the cadence of her steps in the hallway. Partners learned that a raised finger meant their sentence was over. She did not believe she was unkind. She believed she was precise. In her mind, efficiency was a moral good, and discomfort was the necessary friction of progress. The scene in the Grand Regency lobby did not feel to her like a rupture. It felt like continuity. The man's clothes registered before his words, and once registered his fate was sealed by an internal calculus she never questioned. Emily's confidence did not come from cruelty. It came from a system that had rewarded her assumptions every step of the way. Yet the system had been fraying for months. 13 investors had passed on Veritas in quiet, carefully worded declines. Some cited market conditions, others timing, but a few were candid in ways that lingered. One partner slid a marked-up deck back across a polished table and said calmly that the technology impressed him, but the leadership alarmed him that he had watched her dismiss concerns as if they were interruptions rather than warnings. Another wrote that he could not commit capital to a culture that treated dissent as disloyalty. The bluntest of them all spoke over Coffee Eye's steady voice, measured, telling her he would never invest in a person who equated certainty with wisdom and volume with truth. Emily smiled through those conversations, thanked them for their time, and walked out with her spine straight, telling herself that visionaries were always misunderstood before they were vindicated. She told her team that the market was fickle and that patience would be rewarded. She told herself that the rejections were noise. Yet the numbers kept whispering at night, and the whisper had a shape. Burn rate, runway. The knowledge that belief alone did not keep servers running. Still in the lobby that morning, she felt none of that. She felt the familiar assurance that she belonged, and that others needed to prove they did. The man's calm unsettled her, precisely because it did not ask for permission, and her reaction sprang from a reflex honed over decades: protect the perimeter, enforce the signal, remove the anomaly. The coffee flew not from rage, but from certainty, a certainty that had rarely been challenged in rooms designed to echo it. As he walked away, she did not think of race as an idea. She thought of it as an outline, a set of cues she had learned to trust without ever naming them. Around her, the lobby resumed its choreography, but something had shifted beneath the marble, an imbalance she could not yet see, only feel, as a faint pressure behind the eyes, like a headache that announces itself before the pain arrives. Malik Rowe did not hurry as he crossed the threshold of the Grand Regency that morning, because he had learned long ago that speed often invited judgment before words had a chance to breathe, and judgment, when it arrived early, revealed far more about the observer than the observed. He had chosen the black t-shirt deliberately, the clean white sneakers, the backpack instead of a briefcase, the absence of an entourage, because these choices stripped the room of its shortcuts and forced a single question to surface in the minds of the people he met. Do you listen? When status is not announced. Malik had built his fortune in rooms where listening was rare, where founders mistook confidence for clarity and presentation for substance. Rowe Capital's numbers spoke loudly enough when invited to do so. A portfolio spanning 54 companies, patient capital deployed across climate tech enterprise software, and medical AI returns that quietly outperformed legacy firms whose names dominated headlines. But Malik never led with numbers because he believed numbers were the echo, not the voice. He had grown up watching his mother finish night shifts with shoes worn thin at the soles, watching respect be rationed according to uniforms and tone, and he had decided early that he would never allow his worth to be mistaken for his costume, even when that mistake cost him convenience. The moment the coffee struck his shirt, Malik registered the temperature before the insult, the heat before the implication, because experience had taught him that moments like this were rarely about a single act. They were about a pattern surfacing unfiltered. He had been here before, in quieter ways. In meetings where eyes slid past him until credentials were produced, in elevators where assumptions were made without words. In boardrooms where surprise lingered too long after introductions. Yet there was something particular about this moment, something instructive, because it compressed years of observation into a single unmistakable gesture, and gestures Malik knew were truer than apologies delivered later. As he dabbed the stain with a handkerchief, he felt no rush to correct the record, no urgency to announce the capital under his management or the companies he had helped survive impossible quarters, because the test had already concluded itself without his participation. The principle he lived by was simple and demanding: arrive as you are, watch what follows, and believe what you see the first time. He had adopted it after too many meetings where charm disguised indifference, and too many founders who spoke fluently about vision but stumbled over dignity, and it had saved him years of misaligned partnerships. Malik's calm was not performative. It was practiced restraint, the kind forged by knowing that power did not need to raise its voice to be heard. Outside the hotel, he paused not to collect himself, but to take note of the sky, the ordinary continuity of a day that would proceed regardless of a single person's lapse. And he thought about the email he had sent weeks earlier, confirming the meeting, the careful neutrality of his words, the deliberate omission of photographs, because he wanted to meet the leader, not the brand. He considered the company he had been studying for months, the elegance of its code, the fragility of its finances, the red flags he had underlined in the margins of his notes, where leadership culture intersected with hiring data. And he felt the familiar weight of a decision approaching that would not announce itself all at once. Malik had learned that the most consequential moments often arrived disguised as interruptions, and that the measure of a leader was revealed less by how they performed when impressed than by how they behaved when unimpressed. He stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusted the strap of his backpack, and allowed the city noise to fill the space where an explanation might have been offered, knowing that explanations given too soon often robbed a moment of its clarity, and that clarity once earned had a way of demanding answers from those unprepared to give them. The realization arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, paralyzing cold that settled behind Emily Lancaster's eyes while the lobby returned to its polite murmur. Because the world rarely stops to accommodate the moment someone understands they have misread it. Her assistant, pale and unsteady, stood a careful distance away, holding a tablet like a confession she did not want to deliver. And when the words finally came, they landed with the weight of finality, because facts spoken aloud could not be returned to silence. Emily felt the edges of her confidence fray as the name registered, the firm registered the months of internal memos, and red-circled spreadsheets rearranged themselves into a single damning line of causality that pointed back to her own hand. She moved first instinctively toward action, because action had always been her refuge, dialing the number she had insisted remain direct, listening to the ring count itself out while she paced, then hanging up and dialing again as if persistence could substitute for contrition. She typed erased and rewrote messages that sounded reasonable in her head and brittle on the screen. The first called it a misunderstanding. The second finally named it what it was: bias, and asked for one chance to apologize in person. She searched for him on LinkedIn and stared at the empty space where a connection might have been, wrote a note that acknowledged a misunderstanding without naming the harm rewrote. It erased, it sent it anyway, then opened a notebook and wrote by hand, convinced that paper might carry what digital words could not. That ink might slow her long enough to sound human. The minutes stretched, then the hours, and each silence sharpened the memory of his stillness in the lobby, the way he had not rushed to correct her, the way he had chosen observation over explanation. And Emily felt an unfamiliar sensation gather in her chest, not panic, but a tightness born of being evaluated without recourse. She tried to tell herself that investors were rational, that capital followed opportunity, that time would smooth the edges of an incident that could be reframed as a misunderstanding. Yet the framing collapsed under the weight of what she knew now, because rationality did not require forgiveness, and forgiveness could not be compelled by credentials. The office filled with a brittle energy as news filtered in from corners she did not control. Whispered mentions of a video circulating of questions asked by people who had once deferred to her, of a calendar that suddenly looked thin. And Emily realized that the leverage she had relied upon for years was conditional, in ways she had chosen not to see. She stood at the window and watched traffic braid itself into order, each car following rules it did not argue with, and wondered when she had begun to believe that her certainty exempted her from consequence. The phone remained face down on her desk, a small rectangle of possibility that refused to light up, and with each passing minute, the certainty that she could fix anything with enough resolve slipped further away, replaced by the knowledge that some doors did not respond to force, only to timing, and that timing once missed could not be negotiated back into alignment. Her assistant spoke again softly about the runway, about the investors who had paused, and were now reconsidering about the meeting requests that had been canceled without explanation, and Emily nodded without listening, because her attention had narrowed to a single absence, the absence of a reply that might have signaled a willingness to hear her out. She drafted one more message, shorter this time, naming the wrong without dressing it up, and hovered over the send button as if restraint might prove something. Then sent it anyway, and sat back, hands folded, breathing measured, aware that she had exhausted the vocabulary of urgency, and that what remained was waiting a discipline she had never practiced long enough to trust. Outside, the day moved on, and inside the space between action and consequence widened quiet and uncompromising, leaving Emily with nothing to do but notice how the silence sounded different when it was earned. Malik Rowe's silence did not come from indifference. It came from memory, because the shape of Emily Lancaster's urgency echoed a life spent navigating rooms that closed themselves before he could speak. He grew up in Newark, in an apartment that carried the hum of traffic through thin walls, where his mother left before dawn in pressed scrubs and returned after midnight with tired eyes that still managed warmth, and where his father's absence became a quiet fact rather than a wound discussed aloud. Malik learned early that effort did not guarantee recognition, only survival, and that dignity was something you practiced privately before the world ever acknowledged it. At MIT, the scholarship letters were precise and generous, but the campus nights were cold enough that he spent weeks sleeping wherever he could, rotating parking spots and couches to avoid attention studying by the glow of a laptop balanced on his knees, telling himself that this was temporary, and that temporary did not mean invisible. Those years trained him to observe before reacting, to read patterns others dismissed as coincidence, to value consistency over spectacle. When his first startup found traction, it was not because he sold a dream well, but because he built quietly and listened relentlessly. And when the acquisition came, $740 million wired without ceremony, it felt less like arrival than validation. That restraint had its own velocity. Rowe Capital emerged from that restraint, a firm structured to slow decisions, rather than accelerate them to privilege questions that could not be answered with slides alone. Malik insisted that founders meet him as themselves, not as rehearsed versions of success, because he believed ethics traveled faster than revenue once pressure arrived, and he had watched too many companies fracture at the first sign of stress, because leadership treated people as inputs rather than responsibilities. He kept his wealth private, not out of humility, but strategy, understanding that disclosure changed conversations before they began, that numbers could become a substitute for listening, and that attention often corrupted the very signals he wanted to read. The jet existed because time mattered. The absence of headlines existed because judgment mattered more. He dressed plainly because it removed the noise, because it revealed whether curiosity preceded contempt, because it turned meetings into mirrors that reflected the unexamined assumptions of the other side. As he walked through the city after leaving the hotel, Malik replayed, not the coffee, but the stillness that followed it, the reflex that had leapt ahead of inquiry, and he placed that moment alongside others in a mental ledger he kept not to score grievances, but to calibrate alignment. He thought about Veritas Systems with a measured sadness about the elegance of its architecture and the fragility of its culture, about how easily talent could be squandered when leadership confused velocity with virtue, and about the employees whose work deserved stewardship rather than spectacle. Malik knew that money could solve problems quickly, but rarely corrected character, and that waiting through costly often clarified which outcomes were worth pursuing. He reached his apartment, placed his phone on the counter without checking it, and let the quiet settle, trusting that silence when chosen deliberately could become a question no amount of urgency could answer. The numbers arrived first, clean and unforgiving, because numbers never raised their voices and never softened their edges for context. $6 million a month, 41 days of runway. On paper, it meant barely $8 million left before payroll and vendors turned into locked doors. Emily Lancaster stared at the dashboard in the quiet of her office, as if proximity might alter the math, as if focus alone could persuade cash to behave differently. The silence Malik had chosen now echoed in her walls with a different timbre, amplified by alerts that arrived without ceremony, paused commitments, reconsidered terms meetings postponed indefinitely. The bridge round that had once felt tenuous now evaporated entirely, not through a single dramatic withdrawal, but through a series of careful exits that carried the same language: risk management. Reputational concerns, timing phrases that sounded polite while closing doors all the same. Outside her window, the city moved with its usual confidence, unaware that a company with hundreds of employees had been reduced to a countdown that fit neatly on a single slide. The video spread faster than she could contextualize it, clipped and recut, until nuance was sanded away and the moment stood alone, repeating itself across feeds where attention was currency and outrage compounded interest. She watched it once, then again, not to punish herself, but to understand the distance between intention and impact, the way the frame froze her posture into something unmistakable, the way soundless footage refused explanation and asked only for judgment. The board convened on short notice, voices measured faces, controlled questions sharper than usual, and Emily answered them with the precision that had once impressed investors, though now it felt brittle in her mouth. She spoke of mitigation, of statements drafted and counsel retained, of internal reviews and external advisors, and she sensed the shift, as it happened, the subtle relocation of authority from her certainty to their caution. Emails arrived from partners who had once returned her calls within minutes, now spaced hours apart, then days. Their tone careful, their interest conditional, their trust provisional. Human Resources forwarded notes from employees anxious about headlines and job security, and Emily realized that leadership stripped of applause felt heavier than she remembered, because responsibility, when it could no longer hide behind momentum, demanded a different posture entirely. She reviewed contracts late into the night, searching for flexibility where none had been designed, realizing how much she had relied on future funding as if it were a given rather than a gamble renewed every quarter. The cash burn graph did not flinch as she adjusted assumptions. It only shortened the line. Her assistant brought coffee she did not drink, stood nearby, with a tablet full of updates she did not ask for, and waited for direction that no longer came easily. Messages from potential hires went unanswered, their timing suddenly wrong, their optimism out of step with the gravity settling over the office. Vendors tightened terms. Partners asked for assurances she could not responsibly give. Emily found herself rehearsing conversations that ended in candor rather than persuasion, practicing sentences that acknowledged limits instead of projecting inevitability, and the practice exhausted her more than any pitch ever had. The social feeds kept moving, new clips surfacing, commentary stacking upon commentary, and she learned how quickly a narrative hardened once it found a shape that satisfied the public's appetite for clarity. She understood now that apologies delivered into a current did not redirect it. They were either carried along or pulled under. The firm's internal metrics told a quieter story of systems still functioning, of teams still delivering, of value not yet erased by attention. And that contrast sharpened the stakes until they felt personal, because the countdown was no longer abstract, but attached to names and livelihoods she had once assumed would be protected by growth alone. As midnight approached, Emily sat alone with the board's request for a plan that did not depend on optimism, the phone resting face down on her desk, as if to remind her that some calls could not be forced. And she wondered which of her instincts would survive contact with the next 41 days. The red-eye flight pressed time into a narrow corridor where Emily Lancaster could not outrun the math that had followed her across the country. And when she stepped into the glass and steel lobby of Row Capital at dawn, the city felt both awake and indifferent, as if New York had decided to test her patience before offering any answers. She carried the letter folded carefully in her bag, 4 pages written by hand in a script that slowed her thoughts into something closer to listening, and she took a seat where she could be seen, without demanding attention, choosing visibility over interruption for the first time in a long while. Hours moved with the quiet authority of a place that did not rush for anyone. Elevators chimed, shoes crossed, marble conversations passed without sticking, and Emily learned the weight of waiting as a discipline rather than a delay. She declined coffee when it was offered, declined updates from her assistant, declined the urge to rehearse explanations that would sound like bargaining, because she sensed that any attempt to control the moment would reveal itself immediately. The letter remained unread in her bag, not because she doubted its words, but because she had come to understand that words once overused lost their leverage. The clock advanced without ceremony, and with each passing minute, the memory of the hotel lobby sharpened into something precise, a sequence of choices she could now see without the fog of self-justification. And she wondered how often she had mistaken decisiveness for discernment. When Malik Rowe finally appeared, he did so without announcement, without entourage moving through the lobby, with the same unassuming economy that had unsettled her before, and he took the seat opposite her, as if it had been reserved by the silence itself. He looked at her steadily, not with triumph or reproach, but with a focus that made distraction impossible. Then he asked quietly, "What do you think your actions did in that lobby, and what are you willing to lose to make sure they never happen again?" Emily felt the words register, not as an accusation, but as a boundary, a line drawn to clarify what the meeting would not be. And she understood that whatever followed would be measured not by urgency, but by honesty, not by outcomes promised, but by responsibility accepted. And she drew a breath to answer, aware that this moment would not be moved by force or familiarity, only by the truth she had avoided naming aloud. Malik did not raise his voice or lean forward when he spoke, because he understood that leverage worked best when it sounded like clarity rather than force, and the list he placed between them felt less like a negotiation than a map drawn with deliberate care. He began by naming the public acknowledgement not as a performance, but as a record explaining that a press conference would fix the truth in the open, where memory could not edit it later, where responsibility would be carried by the speaker rather than outsourced to statements written in careful distance. He moved next to leadership, stating plainly that stepping down was not punishment, but alignment, that credibility could not be rebuilt by the same authority that had broken it, and that continuity without correction only prolonged harm. He spoke of money without flourish, the $3 million framed not as charity, but as restitution invested forward capital designed to remove friction for founders who had been measured by the wrong metrics for too long, and he insisted on structure rather than symbolism. When he outlined governance, a leadership team with at least 40% representation from communities historically sidelined, not as optics, but as risk management grounded in perspective. It would be separate from any investment in Veritas, an independent fund with transparent reporting, so restitution could not be diluted into corporate recovery. Finally, he addressed access, requesting open review of the human systems that shaped hiring, promotion, and attrition, an independent audit empowered to follow data wherever it led, because accountability that stopped at intention had a way of dissolving under pressure. As Malik spoke, Emily listened without interruption, feeling the familiar urge to clarify rise and then fall, replaced by a steadier recognition that these conditions were not designed to humiliate her, but to prevent a recurrence that apologies alone could not forestall. She noticed the absence of legal language, the absence of threats, the absence of a timeline meant to induce panic, and she understood that the rigor of the proposal lay precisely in its refusal to be rushed. The room held its breath as he finished the city's muted hum, filtering through the glass, and Emily felt the weight of choice settle in a way it never had before, because this decision did not hinge on valuation or leverage, but on whether she would accept a redefinition of success that did not center her. She did not ask for carve-outs or transition periods, did not counter with alternative phrasing, did not test the boundaries for elasticity, because any attempt to bargain would have revealed that she still believed compliance could be partial and consequences divisible. Instead, she nodded once, a small motion that carried the gravity of surrender without spectacle, acknowledging that survival would come only through change that could be measured and seen. Malik watched the nod without reacting, as if noting a data point rather than celebrating a result, and Emily felt the unfamiliar relief of choosing a harder path without negotiating it down to comfort, aware that agreement was only the beginning, and that the distance between assent and action would demand more than resolve. The press room filled early lights, warming to a steady glare that flattened expressions and left nowhere to hide, and Emily Lancaster stepped to the podium without notes because she had learned that prepared language too easily became a shield. She spoke slowly, allowing the room to hear the pauses she once would have edited out. And when emotion rose, she did not swat it away or turn it into spectacle, letting tears come and go without bargaining for sympathy. She described the incident plainly, naming the harm, without softening it, acknowledging the reflexes she had mistaken for standards. And when she reached the sentence that had followed her across the country, she did not rush it, stating that she had become the very thing she once believed. She opposed a leader fluent in metrics and blind to ethics, a builder of systems that optimized for speed while eroding trust. Questions arrived sharp and necessary, and she answered them with a steadiness that surprised even her, declining to litigate intent and returning again to responsibility, outlining the steps already underway, not as promises but as obligations with dates and independent oversight attached. The announcement that followed landed with a different cadence. Row Capital committing $400 million not as a rescue, but as a transfer of stewardship capital paired with governance that placed day-to-day authority in the hands of a newly constituted board, and Emily stated her resignation without ceremony, clarifying that continuity would be measured by outcomes rather than titles. The market reacted cautiously at first, then with a discipline that reflected the new structure, and inside Veritas, the work changed texture. Reviews, opening where they had once closed pathways, widening where they had narrowed data, interrogated with questions that asked who benefited and who waited. Months passed with the quiet intensity of execution, audits completed, and published leadership expanded with intent rather than symbolism. Incentives recalibrated to reward inclusion as a risk mitigant rather than a talking point, and the numbers began to move in a way that felt earned rather than inflated. At the one-year mark, the results were hard to dismiss. Revenue nearly doubled, attrition fell, and product cycles sped up as trust stopped leaking out of the building. Emily watched much of this from the side, present without presiding, attentive without directing, aware that influence had shifted from command to accountability. And as the company found its footing, she felt the unfamiliar discipline of letting systems speak for themselves, knowing that the work ahead would test whether change could persist once attention moved on. The stage light softened the edges of the auditorium and turned the familiar red circle into a place that invited listening rather than judgment. And when Malik Rowe and Emily Lancaster took their seats side by side, the room sensed the distance they had traveled to arrive at the same point without pretending that the distance no longer mattered. The title glowed behind them, a question framed as a mirror rather than a verdict, and Emily felt the quiet steadiness that came from knowing she no longer needed to persuade the room of her importance, only to be accurate about her past, and disciplined about her present. Malik spoke first, not to narrate the incident, but to set a standard describing bias as a set of habits practiced faster than reflection. Habits revealed most clearly when power felt unobserved and the audience leaned forward because the words did not scold or flatter. They clarified. Emily followed her voice, measured, recounting how certainty had once insulated her from curiosity, how speed had masqueraded as excellence, and how the work of change had required her to replace instinct with inquiry, not once, but daily. When the moderator asked the question everyone had come to hear, the one that condensed months of headlines into a single line, Malik paused long enough to let the room breathe, then answered without ornament, explaining that forgiveness was not a transaction offered to absolve harm, but a discipline chosen to prevent bitterness from becoming a second injury, a way to keep judgment from calcifying into a prison he would have to inhabit. He added that his decision had never been about a single leader's redemption, but about a collective future, about engineers and designers and operators whose labor carried value independent of any one person's failure, and that capital, when paired with accountability, could protect that value rather than erase it. Emily listened with a humility that no longer sought validation, understanding that this articulation was not a defense of her, but a boundary around what would not be repeated, and she felt the weight of that boundary as a relief rather than a loss. Questions followed about governance, about metrics that captured culture as rigorously as revenue, about the cost of slowing down to listen, and Malik answered with specifics that turned principles into practices, while Emily described the cadence of oversight that had replaced her authority. The audits published without edits, the meetings where disagreement was no longer treated as delay, but as diligence. The room responded not with applause at every sentence, but with sustained attention, the kind that suggested application rather than admiration. And as the conversation drew to a close, the moderator asked each of them for a final sentence, something the audience could carry back into their own rooms of decision. Malik spoke about noticing who was interrupted and who was believed, about the small choices that accumulated into culture. And Emily spoke about the courage required to decenter oneself long enough for systems to become fairer than instincts. When they stood, the applause arrived as a wave that did not wash away the past, but acknowledged the work that had followed it, and backstage they exchanged a brief nod that carried more weight than ceremony, a recognition of roles clarified and responsibilities sustained. Outside, the city resumed its rhythm, and inside the audience dispersed with a question that did not resolve itself on the way home, a question designed to be practiced rather than answered. And for Emily, the completion of the journey did not feel like closure so much as continuity, a commitment renewed each day to measure leadership by how it treated those least expected to be heard, while Malik left the stage, knowing that the quiet test he had always preferred had done its work not by exposing one person alone, but by inviting many to look again at the reflexes they carried into rooms where decisions were made. If this story resonated with you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more thoughtful, real-world stories like this. I'd love to know what part of the story impacted you most, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments.